Good afternoon, Frank. The news is getting more and more exciting, and I think that the implications of it are largely misunderstood or seen in ways that are somewhat ethnocentric.
I would agree with that.
We tend to think that this is the sort of thing that happens in certain sorts of countries, but not our sort of country. And I don't think we're taking enough notice of the things that are going wrong in the countries like America and Northwestern Europe and maybe one or two others that have very well-established institutions and in which the democratic process, which is our banner, has been working well for so long. And in fact, the fact that 117,000 people in Texas have signed a petition for secession and over 25,000 people in several other states, which I think are not all red states, is something that I would have thought that would have got more attention. And I wonder how much further it will build. Meanwhile, all we do is talk about what's going on in Syria and all the terrible things that the Syrian government may do to its people. We watch Egypt trying to establish democracy, and we think that the new president has exceeded the bounds of his powers and is destroying the chance to establish democracy. But I think that, in fact, what's going on in Syria and Egypt at the moment, bad though it is the same sort of situation in purely analytical terms as is going on in many places, that the institutions which were sufficient to keep a country working up until very recently don't function properly anymore. And it's partly because of the increase in population, more people. But more than that, it's that every part of the population now wants to participate in what's going on, whereas in the past they were content to be told what to do and not to participate. So in such an egalitarian way. So I think that we're moving into a phase of history in which we're going to have to completely rethink how we can run any political unit in such a way that everybody can participate to the extent that they would be satisfied.
Well, your analysis is actually very interesting, but let me, if I may, play a little bit of the devil's advocate. I think I see what you're saying. I mean, in Syria, obviously, you have a crumbling of the governmental institution. You have a certain crumbling of many of the social institutions that allowed the various tribes, if you will, to live peacefully with each other, and at least it allowed the Alawite leadership group to be able to exercise its power without flaunting it to the degree where people took rifles and began to take stands against the government. And then you compare it to what the United States has seen with the recent petitions to various states to secede from the Union. And I would just caution to note that Texas, perhaps off the top of my head, has approximately, 15, 16 million people, and they've collected 116,000 signatures. I mean, that, in the scheme of things, is not very much. And frankly, you and I both know that nothing is ever going to come of that. But nevertheless, the fact that signatures were collected through a normal democratic process, I mean, nobody took to the streets and got their own rifles, which I'm sure there are many of them in Texas. They began to protest through the government institutional channels to seek redress. So I guess what I would posit then is that what we're seeing in Syria and in the United States is a little bit of the same old tale that we've seen back in Europe in the revolutions of the 1840s, what we saw with the French Revolution, when people rebel against the government institutions that control them, that they demand change. And I guess I'm just wondering whether or not this is something that can quite be as analogous as you suggest, and being able to take the institutions that are crumbling in the Middle East and compare it with some sort of prospect of crumbling in the West. Maybe
it's obviously an
I
enormous
said devil's advocate.
It's an enormous stretch, but I think the reason I make the stretch is that I think it's very important that we see it in a larger context. And the tendency always is to compare the place we're looking at subconsciously, not explicitly, with our own experience. Mm-hmm. And that is not working. Nobody's been able to work out what the solution could be in Syria. And nobody really knows what the solution could be in Egypt. Mm-hmm. In both cases, forget for the time being the rights or wrongs of particular people in power. The problem is, how do you manage to put together a system within a geographical unit with those boundaries so that all the different interests will feel that they have a voice? And it's probably most difficult in Syria, and that's why the problem is at its worst in Syria. But it's very difficult in Egypt. And it's very interesting to look at those two countries, especially because those are the core countries of historic Islamic civilization. That is, I know Islam began in the Arabian Peninsula, but Islam, within a few decades of its beginning, took over the civilization of Egypt and Syria. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where the core of Islamic civilization has been since the second half of the 7th century.
The Umayyads were in Damascus, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
And after the pharaohs, all sorts of other civilization centers were in Egypt, and Egypt and Syria have always been in close interaction with each other. Mm-hmm. So what's happening there is really crucial for what's going to happen in that part of the world, and probably a very large area in the next few decades. And it's at the moment we have no idea of how it might be possible to put together a political system in which the identities that make people feel that they could participate could be properly represented in a new form of government.
Well, I would agree that if you look back from the vantage point of a year or so ago, with all the optimism of the Arab Spring, and look at where we are now, it's bleak. If you look at the situation, for example, in Iraq, where the American intervention essentially swept out the old government and hit the reset button and started again. I mean, the Sunnis continue to be governmentally persecuted, if you will. Right? I mean, they claim that they're in no way, shape, or form getting their representative fair share, even though they are the minority. But there's still, I think, that arrest warrant for the Sunni vice president that's floating around.
And they're in the center of the country.
They're in the center of the country. We have ongoing civil disturbances in Tunisia. One of the first places where the Arab Spring began. We have the situation in Egypt. The Libyan situation is in no way, shape, or form quieted down. The American ambassador was just killed by insurgents. We have the obvious problems in Syria. Every 2 or 3 weeks there are spontaneous demonstrations in Bahrain against the Sultan or the Emir. So I don't know if there's going to be a resolution. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to turn out. And these people are all being fueled by the ether, if you will, of the internet. There's a means of communication, and there's a means of comparison. That's perhaps more important in my mind. They can compare the relative degree of their freedom with the degree of freedom that people on the other side of the border might have or don't have. And then they've developed solidarity with people on the other side of the border, even though they may never have met them, but just the idea perhaps that they're from the same religious background and the same broad geographic area of the world. And then there's still I think, a lingering resentment against the West. It's a very noxious brew when it's all put together.
The resentment against the West is not so lingering. It's very close to the surface.
It is.
Some places than others. And I think it's a major factor that is an irritant in all these situations. But so Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt are all places where the discontent with the established system began with one minority and spread to other minorities. And in Afghanistan, it started with the Pashtuns, who were very close to being half the population. But in Iraq, it was the Sunnis, after the American invasion destroyed the previous system. In Syria, it's the Sunnis, and in Egypt, it's the Sunnis. But in each case, there are different points of view, different ideas about what would make a political unit that make it very difficult to work out what could actually bring them all together. And one of the reasons I would use as an excuse for bringing in the American situation, I wanted to do it in order to make the context of our discussion as large as possible. But all these signatures have been collected in almost no time by a particular small minority, which is exactly the way the other thing started. Now, I'm sure nothing is going to come to this, but it's a precedent. That's what's interesting about it. And if you like, there's something similar going on in England with this movement against Europe, which is a minority movement, but is getting stronger and stronger. And there are similar minority movements in several other European countries against one thing or another. So I think that for 50 years after the Second World War, it was taken for granted that the last thing we have to allow to happen internationally is for anybody to change their borders.
Right.
And then, obviously, Israel's border changed. Eritrea became a new country, and now South Sudan. Are there any others? I'm not sure.
They've been very infrequent, that's for sure. The Iron Curtain and George Kennan certainly set a nice precedent. Yeah.
But I think that it's not going to be possible indefinitely to maintain that, simply because we kept everything together by imposing the political institutions of the first half of the 20th century onto the second half of the 20th century. And that was okay, but I don't think they're going to work for the 21st century.
You really are a real radical. I mean, it just now has dawned on me that you're talking about the erosion and melting away of national sovereignty lines.
Well, I've thought for a long time that democracy is a banner that most people take for granted and don't work out what makes it possible. And what makes it possible is what, do you remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan?
Of course.
And I don't know whether we've talked about his letters before, but he wrote an incredible letter to President Nixon during Nixon's first term about the problems with New York City and the fact that everything worked fine when everybody lived in their families and families worked the way they were supposed to and they belonged to their little neighborhood organizations and so on. And everybody was moral in an old-fashioned American way. And by the end of the 60s, they'd ceased to be like that. And for that reason, democracy wasn't working anymore.
Well, I think he may have summed it up in a nutshell there, actually.
It's an amazing lesson.
It is. It is. Let me come back a little bit. So we've talked in the past about the effect and import of a galvanizing kind of event to finally attract the attention of everybody to what's important. And earlier today, as you and I have discussed already today, there were news bulletins coming out from the Middle East that the Syrian military had begun to arm aerial bombs with the nerve agent sarin. The American intelligence had been picking this up. NBC News was reporting it. And despite the warnings of the West to Assad to not use them, there obviously, and the intelligence admitted this, there was nothing that could be done if he in fact gave the order to use them. There would be an attack. So for about 8 or 9 hours since I read those reports, I've been checking. I was pretty confident something was going to happen today. Had something happened, and had Assad used nerve gas in pockets of, say, 3 of the major cities against the rebels, would that have been a galvanizing kind of event?
It would have been really a disaster, because it would have meant that America would have intruded again. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, at this stage, everybody would have expected America to do it. It would have had to happen. But in the medium to long term, it would exacerbate the situation that really has caused the current conditions. If America and America's allies hadn't collaborated to keep Mubarak in power all this time, Assad probably wouldn't have stayed in power all this time either, and the same would have been true of several other people. And the political systems of each of these territories would have evolved according to their internal dynamic, mm-hmm. which may not have been peaceful, but at least it would have been what they had done for themselves, which mm-hmm. is, after all, the way we've evolved. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way politics has to work.
Well, so then when do you shake the Etch-a-Sketch up again and start anew? All right, if you were in the White House and Assad did, or tomorrow does, use chemical weapons, what would the counsel be? What would you say? Just sit tight, let them work it out themselves?
I think at the moment it's not possible to do that, because the problem is that the president has to cater to American public opinion, mm-hmm. and this is what he would be expected to do, mm-hmm. And it will take a long time for that way of thinking in this and other Western countries to change. But I think that we should be building our own Iron Dome,
yes,
and talking to the rest of the world, mm-hmm. rather than refusing to talk to some people and assuming that we can tell them what to do.
Let me pose another question to you. I've never been accused of being the sharpest tack in the drawer. You perhaps have been. But if we're having this discussion, certainly there are people in the highest levels in Tehran who read the same news bulletins we read and have been fearful of the same eventuality as we've been. Would they not gain tremendous prestige and status in the world of nations at the conference table if in fact Assad did use chemical weapons, if they intervened?
That's a very interesting question. And of course, one has no idea of what exactly the Iranian representatives in Syria are trying to persuade the Syrians to do.
Well, the Iranian street, so to speak, would be outraged.
Yeah, yeah.
And they have quite good access to the internet and world news sources.
Yeah. There's one other factor in this that we haven't mentioned, and that is the recognition of a new status for
yes,
Palestinians, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. which has been interpreted as a significant symbolic event in terms of the international standing of Israel and the United States. Mm-hmm. So whether that is going to be a turning point in any way or not, I don't know. But it certainly shows that Israel and the United States don't have the international clout that they have had up until now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think perhaps some of that that clout is undercut by, again, depending upon where you look from. And as an American who remembers the '67 war, and can still sort of feel that there's a justifiable reason for Israel to keep those territories, I think, though, that when the balance of the rest of the world looks at those territories, they are indeed occupied territories that were captured in war that historically belonged to those other countries, and they should give them back.
Mm-hmm. And it's not exactly internationally acceptable in legal terms for them to conduct warfare against people whose territory they're occupying.
That's true too. Yes. Yeah.
So I think that this is all part of the process that we're witnessing of accelerating change, which makes it more and more difficult every week to work out what's going to happen next.
Well, you know, the obvious point, not to forget it though, but what we're talking about is that the change that was already accelerated was the response on the streets that led to the Arab Spring to begin with.
Yeah, and throughout all this process, Iran has not given in to sanctions.
True.
And it's the standing that it is, its standing is increasing as a result of this, I think.
They're holding out against the West.
Yeah.
They're taking the best shot, and they're still there, and you're right. You're right.
But there are several events coming in the next year, including the Pakistan election and the Iranian election, which will be themselves, I imagine, turning points.
And the Israeli election in January.
And the Israeli elections. Right. And there's a new party now just been formed to contest that, which has said that its main point is to conduct negotiations with the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll have plenty to talk about next week.
I do think so. All right, Professor, thank you very much.